this video, we're going to finally talk about the debates and the formats for the debates and how to build your what are called constructive speeches, your main case for or against the resolution. So let's get started here. First of all, this is the speech order and the times for each speech. So we'll have the first affirmative constructive, that's called the 1AC, and that's 5 minutes, followed by a cross-examination period where you ask questions. During this period, first of all, ask clarifying questions if something was confusing to you or you want to understand who the citation came from or something like that. Ask those questions. And then after that, you can ask questions that help set up the arguments that you're trying to make later on. So you can ask, questions about, like, indicting or, questioning the credibility or the sufficiency of their evidence. The first negative constructive after that, followed by a cross-examination period of 1 minute. Then the second affirmative constructive, it's a little bit longer, 6 minutes here, and then a cross-examination period of 1 minute. The second negative constructive, again 6 minutes, followed by a cross-examination period. And then we have our last two speeches called the rebuttals, the first affirmative rebuttal, or the 1AR, for 4 minutes, and the first negative rebuttal also for 4 minutes. So as you can see, each partner, since there are 3 people, will take one of these speeches, either the first constructive, the second constructive, or the rebuttal speech. You will also be given 2 minutes of preparation time during the debate. Typically, you save this time for right before the rebuttal speech. And that way, the person can kind of get their thoughts together and organize their thoughts before giving the rebuttal. So you get 2 minutes of sort of downtime to gather your thoughts before that final speech. So these speeches, that's the length of time and such. What's going on in each of these speeches? So the 1AC and the 1NC, these will be fully scripted speeches, which are building your case, right? You're going to start to defend the points of contention we talked about in the topic overview lecture, and that we'll see more of here in a moment. So this is fully scripted. You can read these speeches. There's no delivery grade for these debates. It's all about the content. So I'm not worried about, eye contact or how many times you stumble over a word or something. Obviously, you should try to not be monotone, but you can go ahead and just script these speeches in advance and read them out. The 2AC and the 2NC, the 6-minute speeches, this is a little bit of a mix between the two types of speeches. So for maybe the first half to 4 minutes of your speech, of your 6-minute speech here, this can be scripted as well, and you can continue building your case. Let's say you're affirmative and you're arguing in favor of the evidence of racism and policing. The 1AC maybe would focus on, say, racial profiling and practices of racial profiling in the police. The 2AC might take something different. Maybe they focus on stop and frisk or the broken windows theory of policing or implicit bias in the way that those affect the way police treat people of color. So, just continue building your cases, offering not the same reasons, but new and different reasons to back up your case. And then for the last 2 to 3 minutes of that speech, beginning your rebuttal. So starting to answer the 1AC or the 1NC arguments. And typically in the rebuttal, the way this takes place is you'll flag what argument you're responding to. So if I was negative, I'd say, now in response to their racial profiling claims, here are my responses, 1, 2, 3, right? If I was affirmative, I might say, here's my response to their crime disadvantage, 1, 2, 3. Or here's my response to their arguments that people of color commit more crimes, 1, 2, 3, etc. Then finally, the rebuttal speeches. Again, these are continuing the rebuttal. So answering anything that you haven't answered yet, maybe the new arguments that were made in the 2AC and the 2NC can be answered in this final rebuttal. You can do a little bit of rebuilding your case if they said something against your case that you think needs to be responded to, that you can respond to those here. And then finally, maybe spending about 30 seconds to a minute kind of giving a closing argument, a wrap up, right? They've made these claims, we've made these claims, our claims are better because, our arguments are better because, and here's why you should vote for the affirmative team or for the negative team. So those are the speech responsibilities and the speech times. Now, how do we build a case? What does a case look like? So first of all, you should start with an introduction. Typically, we state the resolution and whether we're for or against it. So I might say, I'm here to defend the resolution that there is clear evidence of racism in U.S. Policing. If it's resolution 2, then after that, I might need to state my plan. That is what I mean by defunding the police. So I would say, I'm in favor of the resolution that cities should implement a policy of defunding police departments. By defunding police departments, what we mean is cutting their budgets and spending that money more on healthcare workers or social or mental health professionals instead. So just define what you mean by defunding the police, so we kind of know right away. And then preview the main points you will cover. So we'll talk about what are those main points, but we'll talk about racial profiling, and we will talk about the broken windows theory of policing, or we'll talk about the crime disadvantage, and we'll talk about how community-oriented policing is a better solution than defunding the police. So it's a little bit different building your case depending on the resolution. Resolution number 1, for the affirmative, your main point number 1 should be what is racism. That is, define institutional racism, define structural racism, so that, because the resolution, one of the points of contention is there's clear evidence of racism. So what is racism? How do you define racism? This could be a debate, right? The affirmative might want to say racism is, policies that have racially unequal outcomes, whereas the negative will want to say, no, racism is only explicitly biased acts. So then they can say, not most police don't engage in explicitly biased acts. Only, a few police do. Whereas the affirmative wants to say, no, look, more people of color are harassed, are arrested, are pulled over, are abused, are killed. And even if the cops aren't intentionally racist, it's their policies that produce that racism, and that's institutional or structural racism. And then for your main points 2 through whatever you choose, 4 or 5, what is the evidence of that racism? Again, you can label each of these, right? So for point number 2, we will talk about implicit bias. For point number 4, we will talk about the infiltration of white supremacists into, policing systems. For point number 3, we will talk about policing algorithms and the way that the computer software ends up reinforcing racial inequality. For the negative, again, main point number 1, you might want to offer an alternative definition of racism. You might see on the negative oftentimes briefs or articles that say, the evidence isn't clear of racism. Most of the time, those articles are saying, there's a few incidents, but it's not widespread or something like that, which has an implicit definition of racism in those articles. They're talking about racism in the sense of, explicitly biased, not unequal outcomes, but, biased acts by individuals. And defining it that way, I think, puts the negative in a much stronger position. Another thing you might do in this point is, what is the clear evidence, right? They need to have, I think you can argue that, they need to have sort of overwhelming evidence of racism in order to win the debate. Then your main points 2 through whatever is your evidence against racism. Again, you can label each of these. Maybe you would have one of your main pieces of evidence against racism is that it's just bad apples, right? That most cops are doing something, are doing their job well and aren't racist. Another argument you might make is that police face a tough job, right? And yeah, sure, sometimes there's abuse, but they fear for their lives and they're doing a tough job, so it's understandable that that's happening. Another argument that I'm seeing pop up on our briefs is that it's not disproportionate because black people commit more crime. So, my main point number 4 might be black criminality or something like that. So, yeah, black people commit more crime, and because of that, police interact with black people more. That's not proof of racism. It's just proof that, black people commit more crime. For resolution 2, this is going to be a little bit different. So affirmative point, main point 1 through whatever will be your harms or your advantages, right? So what are the things, the problems that defunding the police solves? Again, these might be very similar to the same main points from the first debate that are evidence of racism in policing. So racial policing, racial profiling, police shootings, police harassment and abuse, corruption, white supremacy in police departments, right? And then, at the bottom of each of those advantages, you need to add evidence about how defunding the police solves those problems, right? We might say, one of our advantages is over-policing minority communities. The police spend too much time and resources in minority communities. And then defunding the police, how does it solve that? Well, by defunding the police won't have the time and the resources to over-police minority communities. So basically, each of these advantages or harms should be, organized with what's the problem, and then how does our plan solve that problem. For the negative, you might have some main points which are disadvantages. We'll talk about the crime disadvantage here in a minute. The defunding the police results in more crime. That defunding the police harms police community relations, and that results in more crime or more attacks against police, etc. And then you can also have a main point which is called a counter plan, which is let's not defund the police, let's reform them in some other way. So that one you would say what your plan is, how the plan solves the affirmative harm, right? How does reforming the police, say citizen review boards, how would that prevent racial profiling or prevent police harassment or abuse? Also, how does that avoid the disadvantage, right? You can say, look, citizen review boards don't defund the police and therefore don't increase crime, whereas the affirmative plan does decrease crime. So what do these advantages or disadvantages look like? Again, these are scripted beforehand, and they should be the bulk of the first 2 speeches, all of the first speech, and maybe 2/3 to half of that second speech. These are your big, major claims you will use to support your case. Excuse me 1 second. So things like police involved shooting, defunding increases crime, racial profiling, or police community relations. Typically, one of these advantages or disadvantages will be the subject of the chapter or the essay or the article that you find, right? So there's a lot of articles, for instance, that say defunding the police would increase crime, and that's obviously the main point of that article, and that should be kind of the main point of one of your advantages or disadvantages as well. So how do we structure an affirmative advantage? Again, first of all, we'll start off with the problem, the harms. Again, try to diversify your reasons, right? So if you're talking about racial profiling as a harm, diversify your proof of that goes on, right? Here's a study of traffic stops. Here's a study of how much time police spend in minority neighborhoods. Here's an argument about implicit bias. So try to diversify your reason. And you use your sources or your briefs to back up each of those reasons, as we'll see. And then at the bottom, after you've talked about the harms, You offer the links. That is why the defunding the police solves the problem, right? So you'll have to provide evidence, again, or sources or briefs, that this actually solves the problem. Now, the negative disadvantage, this is a little bit different on how you structure it. First, you start with the links. Why defunding increases crime, why defunding harms police community relations, etc. There's typically more links than anything else. And again, diversify your reasons and use your sources to back that up. After you've provided the impact, the link, you might provide the impact, why this issue matters, right? Maybe some evidence that says crime would really explode if we defunded the police. Or maybe some evidence that talks about the harms of crime, that crime harms the economy, and crime, creates victims, how many violent crimes there are, etc. This is typically at the end of your disadvantage, and you might want to do a little more outside research, right? How many people are affected by crime a year? Or give us a powerful quote about the harms and evils of crime at the end of your disadvantage. So essentially, each of these points that you're making, each link or impact or harm, you'll start with a claim, just like we do with our brief. You can number them and also, be as specific in your claim as possible. Don't just say racial profiling exists, racial profiling exists, racial profiling exists. Give us why we know that, how we know that, what's the data. Then you follow the claim with evidence or data, right? You might include a quote from one of your briefs, an example you found in one of the articles, a statistic from the study, some kind of causal reasoning from one of the arguments or articles you found, a story that was in one of the articles, etc. When you cite your sources, be sure to cite as many sources as you have evidence for them. You'll notice in the debate grading rubric that I'll put online that you have one of the things I'm grading you on is how many sources you use. So be sure to cite them in your speech. And you only have to read the author name, their qualifications, and the date. You don't have to read the full source. So for instance, you might say, Jenkins, a professor at UC in digital media, said in 2014, and then read a quote from me. So we'll finish up here by giving you a couple of examples of advantages and disadvantages. So racial profiling advantage. I would start off and say our first reason to support defunding the police is racial profiling. Number one, studies show that police regularly pull over and stop people of color more than white people. And here I would insert my source or my data. This comes from a study from right? Number two, predictive policing software exacerbates this problem. And here again, I offer some more data for that, or more sources from that, that shows that policing software directs police to go to minority neighborhoods. Number three, police departments target minority neighborhoods. I'm going to insert some data here that says that police spend over 70% of their time in minority neighborhoods. Number four, implicit bias increases profiling. And here I'd explain what implicit bias is a little bit, offer some data, again, one of my briefs maybe that say that police are afflicted by implicit bias and the way that affects how they tend to arrest and pull over people of color more often. Number five, police departments use fines and tickets on people of color to fund their programs. This is something that came from the Ferguson report, if you remember the Michael Brown shooting, about 5 or 6 years ago now. And the Ferguson report that came out said that the Ferguson PD were going around in minority neighborhoods and issuing tickets regularly as a way to fund their police department. And obviously they were doing that to minority communities more regularly. And then my impact for this advantage, racial profiling leads to more arrests and convictions of people of color, destroying their communities. Again, maybe I would offer a quote from the Ferguson report, or a good quote that says that to back up that impact. So you see in this advantage, I have like multiple diverse reasons why there is racial profiling against people of color, and then I have an impact why that racial profiling is a bad thing. Um, also, there should be one more point here. I forgot, um, and where you say how defunding the police would solve this problem. You can do that at the end of the advantage, or you could just make that a separate point, which you call solvency or something like that, or our plan, right? And say our plan, here's what our plan is, and here's why it solves these problems. Now for the negative and example disadvantage, again, our first disadvantage is that defunding the police would increase crime. Number one, my first point of support for this, the U.S. increased police funding in the 1990s and crime went down. And here's my data and source for that. Number two, studies show that police presence deters crime. That is, when police are seen out and about in the neighborhood, the crime tends to go down. Number three, broken windows policing reduces crime. Broken windows policing is the idea that minor offenses like graffiti and broken windows, that police should police those, because when you allow those to go unchecked, then that creates an environment where people feel like crime is okay. So if you live in a neighborhood with a lot of graffiti and broken windows, then people are more likely to also break into houses or rob a liquor store or whatever. So the theory says if you clean up the broken windows, that you also make the liquor store robberies less likely. Number four, criminals will take advantage of defunding. So there's arguments that criminals will know that the police have been defunded and will see that as an opportunity to go out and commit more crime. Number five, my impact crime creates a cycle of poverty and results in more racism and more inequality. Right, when there are crimes in minority neighborhoods, that harms those neighborhoods and creates this cycle of poverty. And as their minority neighborhoods are impoverished, then people use that as a justification for their racism. And obviously, poverty of people of color results in more racism and more inequality. So hopefully you see basically how these advantages and disadvantages are structured. Essentially, they're structured just like our a paper and such, where you have a main point and you have the subpoints defending it, right? So we have a main point, racial profiling. We have a main point, black criminality. And then we offer multiple subpoints to defend those. Those subpoints should each be backed up with sources and with data that you found in our briefs. So try to diversify your claims, have as many different claims as possible, and back each of those claims up with data. Diversifying your claims will make it more difficult on the other team to answer them, right? So if I only have one reason why racial profiling occurs, then it's much easier for the negative team to answer it than if I have 5 or 6 reasons why racial profiling occurs. The same with the crime disadvantage. If I have 4 or 5 reasons why defunding the police will increase crime, then it becomes harder for the affirmative team to answer it. So diversify your reasons, offer as many claims as you can, and back up each of those claims with data from our briefs. And if you do that, I expect everyone to have high grades on these debates, and I'm really looking forward to them. So have a good week, and be sure to complete your briefs for this week.